In this video, we take a look at the executions carried out in the United States during July 2025. We'll explore the stories behind each case, the crimes they committed, their final words, and their last meal. This documentary contains factual descriptions that may be sensitive to some viewers. It is presented with care, respect, and the intention to inform. Edward James Zakrzewski II spent exactly 29 years on death row after being convicted for the murder of his wife and their 2 young children. He was executed on July 31, 2025 at Florida State Prison by lethal injection. Throughout that time, his case remained one of the most chilling in the state's criminal history. But what happened inside that family home in Mary Esther is still hard to comprehend. To understand how it all came to be, we must go back to his origin. Edward James Zakrzewski II was born on January 31, 1965 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He grew up in an environment about which little is known, but his college attendance was brief before deciding to enlist in the United States Air Force, seeking a structured career with future prospects. He was initially stationed at a base in Montana, although other reports suggest it may have been Idaho. It was at one of these bases where he met Sylvia, a South Korean waitress working to support herself after ending a previous marriage to another American serviceman. Sylvia's family living in South Korea had strongly disapproved of that previous relationship. Even when she traveled with her then-husband to visit them, the rejection was evident, influencing her decision to divorce. Edward, on the other hand, made a completely different impression. After starting a relationship, he and Sylvia married around 1986. In 1987, their first child was born, Edward James Zakrzewski III, nicknamed Kim. In 1989, Zakrzewski was stationed at a base in South Korea. Sylvia, who never hid how much she missed her homeland, received the news with joy. For her, it was a chance to return home. While in Korea, their second child was born, a daughter named Anna. Sylvia's family welcomed Edward warmly, a stark contrast to her ex-husband. Everything seemed to be going well. But in 1992, things changed. Zakrzewski was reassigned to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The family settled in Mary Esther, a small town in Okaloosa County. That's when the relationship began to unravel. Sylvia felt miserable, deeply nostalgic, and isolated. The cultural difference, racism, and the rejection she faced as the mother of biracial children affected her seriously. She repeatedly expressed her desire to return to South Korea, this time with her children. The marriage deteriorated rapidly. Neighbors would later testify that Edward had seriously stated that if Sylvia ever tried to leave him, he would kill her and the children. No one reported this to the authorities. June 9, 1994 was a day that would forever change this family's history. Edward was at work on base when he received a phone call. His son, Kim, only 7 years old, was the one who spoke to him. He said his mother planned to divorce him and take both children back to South Korea. Some reports suggest Sylvia instructed her son to deliver that message. During his lunch break, Edward went to the base exchange store and purchased a machete. There didn't seem to be an immediate reason, but all signs point to a decision already being made. Later, he went to a bar and met with a veteran friend. During their conversation, Zakrzewski made a disturbing remark. He said he wondered what it would be like to kill someone. He returned home in the afternoon. Sylvia and the children weren't there yet. Edward hid the machete, a crowbar, and a rope in the bathroom. He meticulously prepared the space where he would commit the crime. When his wife and children returned, he waited in the bedroom with the crowbar. Sylvia didn't go in, so he went to look for her. He found her on the couch, eyes closed, resting. He attacked her from behind with the crowbar, hitting her so hard she lost consciousness. He dragged her to the bedroom and continued beating her. Then he strangled her with a rope. Not satisfied, he would later mutilate her body with the machete to ensure she was dead. He then went to the bathroom and called his son Kim, asking him to brush his teeth. The boy obeyed, unaware. While he brushed, Edward attacked him with the machete, striking his head, neck, and back. Kim died from the injuries. Edward placed his body in the bathtub. He then called Anna, 5 years old, under the same pretense. He repeated the same brutal act and placed her body in the tub on top of her brother's. Finally, he dragged Sylvia's body and laid it over the children. 3 blood-soaked bodies stacked in the same bathroom where just minutes earlier, the kids had brushed their teeth. After the murders, Zakrzewski showered, changed clothes, and went back to a bar where he drank until he was heavily intoxicated. He fell asleep in his car, parked just outside. A patrolling police unit found him. They woke him, confirmed his drunken state, and confiscated his car keys, instructing him to pick them up later when sober. Hours later, at dawn, he returned to the house. Without keys, he broke a window to enter. He changed into his military uniform, took Sylvia's car, and drove to the bar where his own car remained parked. Using a spare key, he retrieved his vehicle and went to a bank, withdrawing $5,000 in cash. He then flew from Orlando to Hawaii. In Hawaii, he adopted the name Michael Green. He met a pastor and his wife who ran a religious commune. He told them he was a man seeking redemption and peace. They allowed him to stay in a shack on their property in exchange for maintenance work. No one suspected a thing. On Monday, June 13, 1994, concerned about his unauthorized absence, military personnel from Eglin Base visited his home. The sheriff was also called. Upon arrival, they saw the broken window and entered. What they found left them stunned. In the bathroom, the lifeless bodies of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna stacked in the bathtub. That same day, the country was rocked by another headline. The bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had been found in Los Angeles. The O.J. Simpson case dominated media attention. Meanwhile, the triple murder in Florida went largely unnoticed. Zakrzewski became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. No one suspected he was in Hawaii, where he had no known connections. 4 months later, on October 14, 1994, his case was featured on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, which included his photos and a public alert. The pastor who housed him watched the show while Zakrzewski was in the room. He commented aloud that the man on TV looked a lot like him. Zakrzewski nervously laughed and said, "Yeah, he looks like me, but that's not me." The pastor and his wife decided to speak with him the next morning, but by October 15th, Zakrzewski was gone. Instead of fleeing again, he voluntarily walked into a police station in Hawaii. Perhaps he realized it was only a matter of time before he was caught. He was extradited to Florida on October 25th. In August 1995, while awaiting trial, he attempted to escape with another inmate. They were caught trying to climb the prison fence. On March 19, 1996, Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to all 3 murders. During the sentencing phase, his attorney Elton Killam pleaded for leniency. He argued that his client had acted under severe psychological pressure.
The motivation was that he perceived everything as so hopeless about his wife having happiness or his children having happiness that he decided to end their misery by taking their lives.
According to the defense, Sylvia had emotionally abused him, been unfaithful, had a gambling addiction, and constantly threatened to take the children away. They claimed Edward feared his children would grow up discriminated against in South Korea for being biracial. His thinking, they said, was deeply distorted, and he believed he was acting out of compassion. The prosecution, led by Bobby Elmore, dismantled that narrative. He argued that the crimes were premeditated, brutal, and emotionally devastating. Elmore focused especially on Anna's death, a 5-year-old girl likely killed last, and who may have witnessed her brother's murder. He insisted there was no mercy, only calculated violence. The jury recommended the death penalty for the murders of Sylvia and Kim, with 7,005 votes. For Anna's murder, the result was 6,006, which translated to a life sentence. But Judge G. Robert Barron overruled that recommendation. He determined that Anna endured unimaginable terror before her death, and imposed the death penalty in her case as well. In his words, "This court cannot imagine a more heinous or inhumane way to die." On April 19, 1996, Zakrzewski was sentenced to death for all 3 murders. Over the next 29 years, he filed multiple appeals. All were denied by the Florida Supreme Court in 1998, 2003, and 2018, by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1999 and by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in 2006 and 2009. In 2017, he requested a review of his sentence under a new law requiring unanimous jury verdicts to impose the death penalty. But the court rejected the request, stating the legal change was not retroactive. In 2023, that law was repealed. On July 1, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Edward Zakrzewski. On July 31, 2025, Edward James Zakrzewski spent his final day after 29 years on death row. The day began before sunrise. He woke up around 5 o'clock a.m. and quietly prepared for what was coming. Though he was offered a final meeting with a spiritual advisor, Zakrzewski declined. For his last meal, he made a detailed request: fried pork chops, potatoes, bacon, fried onions, toast, root beer, a slice of pie, a scoop of ice cream, and a cup of coffee. Everything was served as requested. Later that afternoon, he was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison and strapped onto the gurney. A white sheet was placed over him and the final preparations were made. At exactly 6 o'clock p.m., the curtain to the witness room was raised. 14 witnesses were present, including reporters and prison officials. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Zakrzewski responded without hesitation. With a tone mixing irony and resignation, he said, "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold and calculated, clean, humane, and efficient way possible. I have no complaints whatsoever." Then in a calm voice, he began reciting Robert Frost's poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. However, he did not finish. His voice faded halfway through the verse. At 6:04 p.m., the lethal drugs began to flow. Zakrzewski gasped a few times, his chest rising and falling in sharp jolts. Within moments, his breathing slowed and ceased. By 6:12 p.m., he was still. 1 minute later, at 6:13 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. He was 60 years old. After nearly 3 decades of appeals, confinement, and silence, a dark and disturbing chapter in Florida's criminal history came to a close. Michael Bernard Bell spent 3 decades on death row. On July 15, 2025, he was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 54 years old. He had been convicted for the murder of 2 people outside a bar in Jacksonville in an attack that sparked horror, and even 3 decades later, still raised questions due to the controversial testimonies that led to his conviction. But to understand how it all began, we need to go back to the winter of 1993. Michael Bernard Bell, known simply as Mike to friends and family, was born in Florida in the 1970s. He grew up in an environment marked by family conflict, economic hardship, and a lack of stable, protective figures. Little is known about his childhood, but the pattern in his adult life reveals a clear truth. Mike was someone who learned to resolve tension through violence. As a teenager, he was frequently involved in trouble. He was known for having a short temper. He argued with neighbors, fought with other local youths, and struggled to maintain steady relationships. According to reports later reviewed in court, he had shown signs of extreme impulsivity and aggression from an early age. In September 1989, at just 19 years old, Mike committed his first known crime. That day, he was driving through Jacksonville with his girlfriend, Lise Coward, a young woman he had a turbulent relationship with, and her 2-year-old son, Travis. No one knows for sure what happened inside the vehicle, but Mike pulled over, got out, and shot them both. Later, he claimed Lise had been unfaithful. There was no trial for the murders at the time. The bodies were found, but with no evidence tying Mike to the crime, the case went unsolved until he confessed years later. The justice system overlooked the killings, but it marked the start of a deadly path. 4 years later, in August 1993, he killed again. This time, the victim was Michael Johnson, his mother's boyfriend. Johnson was known in the neighborhood, and not for good reasons. Many described him as violent, short-tempered, and physically abusive. On the day of the incident, he and Mike's mother had a serious argument. Mike didn't intervene immediately, but the anger lingered. Later that day, he tracked Johnson to his home and shot him on the porch. It wasn't a sudden outburst, it was calculated. Both crimes remained in the shadows. They weren't part of any official record when Mike was arrested for the double homicide in December 1993. It was during that trial that he revealed his earlier murders, confessing to what he had done years before. Even investigators were shocked. What had seemed like a one-time act of revenge now looked like a clear pattern of serial violence. Mike wasn't someone who lost control once. He was someone who, on at least 3 occasions, had chosen to kill to solve his personal conflicts. On the night of December 9th, 1993, the air in Jacksonville was cold, and the downtown streets were bustling with nightlife. Outside a popular liquor store that also operated as a bar and club, dozens of people waited in line, unaware of what was about to happen. Among them were 22-year-old Jimmy West, 18-year-old Tamika Smith, and another young woman whose identity was never publicly revealed. That same night, Michael Bell was also out, but not for fun or company. He was hunting for Theodore Wright, the man who had killed his brother Lamar 5 months earlier. The court had ruled that Wright acted in self-defense, but Mike never accepted the verdict. From that moment on, his life had only one mission: revenge. He said it repeatedly to friends and family. And that night, he thought he'd found his chance. He spotted a yellow Plymouth parked outside the club, the car he believed belonged to Wright. What he didn't know was that Wright had sold the car to his half-brother Jimmy West. That mistake would prove fatal. Mike went home, picked up 2 friends, masked himself, and took an AK-47 rifle loaded with 30 bullets and 160 more in reserve. He returned to the scene and waited in the dark. The car was still there. Sometime after midnight, Jimmy, Tamika, and the other woman came out of the club and got into the car. They weren't in a hurry. Mike stepped out of the shadows, walked toward the car, raised the rifle, and opened fire. It was a hail of bullets. Jimmy was struck 12 times and died instantly. Tamika was hit 4 times. Despite efforts to save her, she died en route to the hospital. The third woman, in shock, dove to the floor and survived without a single scratch. But Mike wasn't finished. He turned the rifle toward the club's entrance and fired again. Bullets hit the building, and some even struck a nearby house where 3 children were playing. Miraculously, none were hurt. After the shooting, Mike fled. Later that night, he arrived at his aunt's house. Concerned by his demeanor, she asked what was wrong. He replied, "Theodore got my brother, and now I got his." The crime left the community stunned. No one understood what had happened. No one imagined that the tragedy had resulted from a fatal mistake and an obsession that had silently grown over months. Despite the number of shots fired, the presence of witnesses, and the chaos of that night, police didn't arrest Mike immediately. The investigation stalled for months. It wasn't until unexpected testimonies emerged that the case gained traction. A year after the shooting, 2 inmates serving unrelated sentences contacted the authorities. Henry Edwards claimed he had been standing on a nearby corner the night of the crime. He said he saw Mike put on a mask, approach the yellow car, and open fire. His statement was detailed. He described the weapon and the exact moment of the attack. The second witness, Charles Jones, testified that Mike had confessed the crime to him days later and even tried to sell him the weapon. While some questioned their motivations since both were already incarcerated, court records indicate that neither man received any sentence reductions or special treatment. They testified under oath. The final piece came from Mike's girlfriend, Erica Williams. She stated that at Mike's request, she had purchased the AK-47 just 1 day before the attack. Her testimony was damning. It confirmed premeditation. The jury was no longer in doubt. Mike was arrested and formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, held in March 1995, he pleaded not guilty. He claimed self-defense, saying he believed Jimmy West was about to pull a gun. He tried to mirror the argument that had spared Wright months earlier, but this time it didn't work. A club security guard took the stand, describing the chaos, the screams, the bullets, the bodies, terrified people crawling on the ground, and the children yelling in the neighboring house. The prosecution also presented prior convictions. Mike had been found guilty of armed robbery in 1990. Mike's mother testified in his defense. She spoke of his efforts to maintain a job, his conflicts with Jimmy and Theodore, and said her son had been threatened. But her testimony wasn't enough to alter the jury's perception. With 3 aggravating factors and only 1 weak mitigating circumstance, the jury sentenced Mike to death for both murders. For the next 30 years, Mike lived in a cell on Florida's death row. Day after day, he faced the same routines: isolation, silence, repetition. Meanwhile, his defense attorneys fought tirelessly to overturn the sentence. They argued that the trial had been tainted by racial bias. The prosecutor had referred to Mike as someone who lived by the law of the jungle, a phrase loaded with dehumanizing and racially charged connotations. Worse yet, his own attorney repeated that phrase in front of a mostly white jury. They also pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimonies. They alleged procedural errors, overlooked doubts, and insisted that the jury failed to consider Mike's young age at the time of the crime or his mental state. But none of the appeals succeeded. Year after year, hope faded. In June 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. His spokesperson, Brian Griffin, announced it publicly. Florida was moving faster than ever on executions, and Mike Bell would be the state's 8th execution that year. John Bloom, director of the Death Penalty Project at Cornell University, explained that many of those executed in 2025 had been waiting for decades. He added that state authorities had adopted a much more aggressive approach. There were no more prolonged delays, no more hesitation. The date was set, July 15, 2025, but just days before the execution, 2 revelations emerged that could have changed the outcome if only they had come sooner. Henry Edwards, the star witness at trial, signed a sworn statement admitting he had lied. He said he didn't see the shooting. He was inside a store when the gunshots rang out. Detective William Bellina, he claimed, had shown him a photo of Mike and told him exactly what to say. According to Henry, the message was clear: do what you're told or face consequences. 2 days later, Charles Jones also recanted. He admitted that the story about Mike confessing and trying to sell the gun was fabricated. Both Bellina and prosecutor George Bate, he said, pressured him, promised him favors, and he lied out of fear. Mike's defense acted swiftly. They presented both statements as evidence of official misconduct and manipulation. But the judge dismissed them. He ruled that the new testimonies would not have changed the original verdict. The U.S. Supreme Court also declined to intervene. On July 15th, Mike woke up at 6:30 a.m. His last meal was an omelet, bacon, home fries, and orange juice. He received no visitors except for a spiritual advisor. At 6 o'clock p.m., he was taken to the execution chamber. He was strapped to the gurney and IV lines were inserted. When asked if he had any final words, he looked straight ahead and said, "Thank you for not letting me spend the rest of my life in prison." At 6:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. The execution was quick, quiet, uneventful. The state had already carried out 7 executions that year. Mike was the 8th. Nationwide, his execution marked the 26th of 2025, already exceeding the total for the previous year. In a country that once seemed to be scaling back on the death penalty, a new wave of executions was underway. And Michael Bernard Bell, guilty or not, became part of that statistic.